Welcome back to another episode of the Gridiron Guys, and today we are going to be covering 5 extremely undervalued wide receivers for this year in fantasy football. And we are not going to be covering the 2 receivers that I've already put 2 videos up on, which are Marvin Jones and Calvin Ridley. Those guys, I'm very high on both of those guys. As you have seen in those videos, I think Calvin Ridley can have a Chris Godwin-like jump, and I think Marvin Jones is going to be a very viable wide receiver too for majority of the year. So if you have not already watched those videos, I recommend you stop this video, go watch those and come back, because I'm going to be talking about 4 or 5 more receivers that I think are going to be extremely valuable, like Calvin Ridley and Marvin Jones. And I made sure to pick wide receivers all throughout the draft board. We have some guys that are going towards the top of the draft, and we also have some guys who can be picked even later than Marvin Jones in the second to last, maybe even last round, and give you great fantasy production. So let's start with some of the guys who have the higher ADPs, and that is Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And for some reason, these guys have ADPs that are way lower than I anticipated them having prior to looking this fantasy season. I mean, let's start with Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp finishes as the wide receiver 4 in 2020, and he finished the year slow. I mean, he had some inconsistencies. He did have some crazy games against the Bengals, putting up around 220 yards receiving, I think. Had a great game against Seattle earlier on in the year. But wide receiver 4 is wide receiver 4. Right now, he's not even being drafted as a wide receiver 1. I think his ADP is a little low because he slowed down at the end of the year when the Rams started to switch up their offense, and Higbee started to do really well as Robert Woods. But Sean McVay knows how good Cooper Kupp is. And just if you are down on Cooper Kupp, listen to his per-game stats over the last 2 seasons. Keep in mind, he played 8 games 2 years ago because he tore his ACL. But last year, he showed us he was not slowing down one bit. And his per-game stats over his last 24 games, last 2 seasons, are 5.6 receptions per game, 72 yards, and 0.66 touchdowns per game. If you take that per 16 games, that is 90 receptions for 1,152 yards and 10 touchdowns, which is an easy wide receiver 1 finish for next year. I mean, he probably won't replicate wide receiver 4, but he's capable of doing so because his target share is going to be huge because they lost Brandon Cooks. Todd Gurley's going to be out. I don't think they're going to run as much because they're going to be running with Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown. I mean, that's no Todd Gurley. Even if Todd Gurley was washed up last year, he'll see an uptick in targets, I believe. He has elite touchdown potential, showing us he can score double-digit touchdowns. And he's shown he can get a ton of yards on a season, getting, I think, around 1,100 last year. And a really, really good per-game basis the year prior. I mean, you take his last 24 games, he's on pace for over 1,100 yards. You're getting this guy in the 3rd and 4th round. It's crazy to me. I think his ADP should be somewhere in the low 2nd round because he should finish as a wide receiver 1. And I understand the emergence of Tyler Higbee will scare people, I guess, and Gerald Everett because maybe they'll take the Brandon Cooks role. But Cooper Kupp was still balling out with Brandon Cooks and Todd Gurley on the field. There's only more possibility for a higher target share that he didn't have last year. I mean, this is a guy that has elite upside and I think a pretty solid floor because the Rams are going to be passing the ball a lot and there isn't a crazy demand for targets in that Rams offense. Cooper Kupp is that guy along with Robert Woods. They're going to be getting a ton of targets. This is the guy that I'm targeting in all of my leagues. I love Cooper Kupp. If you can get him as a wide receiver 2, that's great value. But if you go running back, and maybe even running back in the 3rd round, and you're able to get Cooper Kupp, high 4th round or late 3rd round, he's a very viable wide receiver 1 option for picking some guy in the 3rd or 4th round. I mean, it's hard to find guys outside the top 2 rounds. You can match up with guys like Michael Thomas, DeAndre Hopkins, Devante Adams, and Cooper Kupp can do that. He showed us last year, finishing as the wide receiver 4, and he's just being drafted way too low. But let's talk to his counterpart in Robert Woods. And Robert Woods is a guy who's been consistently slept on throughout his career. The last 2 years, he's had over 1,000 yards. Last year, he put up a great fantasy season, finishing as a wide receiver 2 for the year. And he only scored 2 touchdowns last year. So I looked, if we gave Robert Woods 5 touchdowns on the year, because his 2 seasons prior, he scored 5 and 6 touchdowns. Last year, Robert Woods scores 3 more touchdowns. He finishes the wide receiver 11 for the year. And right now, he is getting no wide receiver 1 consideration at all. He has a better ADP than Cooper Kupp, being drafted majority of the time in the 4th round. Kupp is sometimes in the 3rd. And last year, he finished the year so hot. I mean, I took his last 8 games. It was really his last 6 games after the Rams bye week, but I took his last 8 games. And if you take the yardage totals for the last 8 games of 2019, he would have finished the year with 1,558 yards for the year, and probably would have finished as a top 3 wide receiver with those totals. I mean, he showed us over the last 8 games he has elite upside, putting up multiple, I think 3 100-yard games, and they were good 100-yard games, like 172, 130 yards, and we'll get his game log right now. And he offers elite upside because he's great in PPR, but half-point PPR is what I'm making my rankings off of. And he's still very good. He has 90 balls a year around. He finished the last 2 years over 1,000 yards. He doesn't miss games. And as I mentioned with Cooper Kupp, Todd Gurley and Brandon Cooks are both not there this year. There is a lot of touchdowns to be grabbed with Todd Gurley's 12 not being there. Brandon Cooks' target share is gone. So Robert Woods is the dominant wide receiver 1 on the outside. And he has a great ADP. That's the thing with Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. They're not as talented per se as maybe an Odell Beckham being drafted similarly around them, but their situation is so much better. They're going to thrive with McVay. They've shown they can put up great numbers, and their ADPs are really good especially for teams that go running back, or even running back early, and are able to get really, really consistent guys with high upside on a weekly basis. Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods are guys I'm targeting in all of my leagues after I draft running backs early, and they are great value at their current ADPs. But now we have a guy who is all upside, a division rival of the LA Rams. We have DK Metcalf, and DK burst onto the scene last year after falling in the 2019 draft to the Seattle Seahawks in the 3rd round. And he showed us he could straight up play. DK may not be a elite route runner, not being able to run every single route from the tree, but he proved us wrong, showing that he could put up elite production with limited route running capabilities. And I expect him to learn a lot more routes this year, work on his route tree, become a more, well-rounded and balanced wide receiver. And that's only going to help DK Metcalf. And I also think he has a lot going for him going into this fantasy season. So let's start with, he finished as wide receiver 30 last year. And I'm going to be bold and say that is his floor. DK is a top 30 lock because of how athletic he is. No matter how poor he plays, he will make plays. And this year he's being ranked as the 22nd wide receiver in half PPR. And I think that's an easy ADP for DK to break. Last year, he only saw 100 targets, and that's not a lot. I expect this year DK to see a big bump in targets for a few reasons. 1, the Seattle running game will not be as a high volume attack as it was last year for a few reasons. Chris Carson has shown he can't overcome his fumbling issues. They were a really big factor last year, which is why Rashad Penny factored into the equation a lot. But Rashad Penny is probably start the year on the PUP list, which means he's unable to perform in the beginning of the year. So they signed Carlos Hyde. And I mean, I don't expect them to be running in the same capacity as last year. Carlos Hyde or not, even if all 3 of those guys are there, I think this is the year that the Seahawks finally give the keys to Russell Wilson and let him be that dominant pass-throwing player that he can be. Because a lot of times they let Russell manage the game, then make plays when he has to. He checks it down. But this year, I think we could see a Russell Wilson that commands the offense up-tempo. They have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, possibly Josh Gordon, Greg Olsen, Will Disley. There's a lot of weapons for Wilson. He hasn't had these good weapons in a long time, maybe even best weapons that he's had in his career. And I think that DK's targets are going to go up. I think he's going to be a better wide receiver than last year. And he's easily going to outperform wide receiver 30. I mean, he's playing with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He doesn't even have to get 125 targets to be wide receiver 22. He is Russell Wilson. I mean, this guy has all the upside in the world. I mean, I could easily see 1,200 yards and 12 touchdowns from DK this year, with only a few more targets because of how athletic he is. He has the potential to have A.J. Brown-like efficiency with Ryan Tannehill. We saw the difference that Brown put up over the course of last year when Tannehill came in. I mean, there's not a lot of numbers to be crunched. It's more so that DK can take that next step and be a true wide receiver 1 in fantasy football next year. And I believe in DK Metcalf. Will he finish as a top 10 wide receiver? I'm not sure. But I think at wide receiver 22, the floor is solid and the upside is so good that if you're trying to win your league, you got some nice running backs, you're drafting him as a wide receiver 2, take him every single day of the week. He has such high potential. And I love DK Metcalf because everything's going right for him. Everything's lining up for him to have a tremendous year. Russell Wilson's going to throw more. Seattle's going to run less. He has a guy opposite him who can demand some attention, Tyler Lockett. I mean, he is going to have a tremendous season this year. And another guy who I think is going to have another great season after breaking out last year and proving all the haters wrong is Devante Parker. And this guy had such high potential coming out of college and just fizzled out for, I believe, 3 years. Last year was his 4th year in the league, I think. And last year he straight up balled. I mean, finishing as the wide receiver 6 in fantasy. And the crazy stat is, after the Josh Rosen experiment ended for the first 3.5 games, when Devante Parker played with Fitzpatrick for the last 12.5 games, he finished as the wide receiver 2 over that time period, only behind Michael Thomas. And this guy is being drafted as the wide receiver 26 when he finished as the wide receiver 2 with Ryan Fitzpatrick at the helm last year. And that's crazy. Because Tua is scaring away drafters because we saw how bad Parker was with other QBs that were incompetent, but those QBs were way worse than what Tua will be if he takes over for Fitzpatrick. I mean, if Tua comes in the middle of the year and takes over for Fitzpatrick, that means the Dolphins have faith in him to play better than Fitzpatrick because Brian Flores is a coach who wants to win now. People are sleeping on this Miami team. They have a great defense. I think they're going to surprise a lot of people. I think they're going to win some games early. And if they're winning, Fitz is going to keep playing. I think Fitz will play as long as Miami's playing well, and I expect them to have a good start to the year. I think Fitz will play far more than 2 to 4 games. I expect closer to 6 to 10 games. And that's elite wide receiver 1 potential for Devante Parker during that time. And if Tua comes in, I think it's tough to say Devante Parker is no longer fantasy relevant because I found a stat that made me realize how well Parker actually played last year. To put it into perspective, Parker had to play against the 2 best corners 4 times last year in Tre'Davious White and Stephon Gilmore. And that's my opinion, but I think consensusly, Stephon Gilmore and Trey White are among the best corners in the league. In those 4 games against guys shadowing him across the field, these are guys that locked up everybody they played. Last year, Parker, in those 4 games, had 20 receptions for 327 yards and 3 touchdowns against the best of the best, which is around 70 to 80 yards a game and a 3/4 of a touchdown every game. That's a good fantasy week against the best of the best. I'm pretty sure Stephon Gilmore, who locked up everybody last year, said, Parker is one guy who gave me trouble, and that's some high praise. I mean, the wide receiver 26 draft position is absurd. He finishes the wide receiver 6, and he finishes the wide receiver 2 with Fitzpatrick over that time period. Don't let Tua scare you away. It's important to get the hot starts in fantasy, and he'll have great trade value for where you draft him at. And say Parker comes out in the first 3 weeks and is just balling out Fitz, puts up 100-yard games, a few touchdowns. He has such high trade value. Just get rid of him right there. If you think Tua's going to come in, there's rumblings that Tua's going to come in, and you don't want him anymore, his trade value will be very high for a desperate owner. I love guys who can start hot because you have so much flexibility with your team to make moves for the future in the championship because you have wins and you have players that people want. I think Parker being drafted in the 5th or 6th round is a great value. I've been getting him as a flex on my mock drafts, and when I see him as my flex with wide receiver 1 potential for the year, I love my team, and he's a great guy to target being drafted in the 5th and 6th round. Parker is a guy that in every single mock draft, I would say he's my guy that I'm targeting for my flex position because I think he's going to be that good once again. He was a first-round pick. He's a talented wide receiver, and people have to stop sleeping and realize he's here to stay, and he's going to have a great fantasy season this year. And now moving on to my last wide receiver who I think is greatly undervalued, is a late-round sleeper that is getting, I feel, no hype whatsoever, and that's Desean Jackson. And I understand why Desean Jackson may not be getting the hype because he's perennially injured. He missed 14 games last year getting hurt against Atlanta, being shut down for the year. But people forget how good he is when he's on the field. Philly went out of their way to improve their wide receiver corps. They got Jalen Reagor. They got Marquise Goodwin. I mean, those are two great additions to a roster that lacked tons of depth at that position. But Alshon Jeffrey is going to start the year in the PUP. He's not going to play the first 6 games likely. Who knows if he plays the entire year? And one quote that made me realize how good Desean Jackson could be this year is when Doug Peterson was quoted saying, Jalen Reagor will learn behind Desean Jackson this year due to our limited offseason. Desean Jackson is the wide receiver 1 going into the year, playing with a QB who should be amongst the league's best in Carson Wentz. I mean, if you don't think Desean Jackson's good, look back to last year, the one game he played against Washington the first week. He had 8 catches for 152 yards and 2 touchdowns, led the team in targets in that game, and put up, I believe, the best fantasy wide receiver week in week 1 last year. He is crazy talented, and I understand he gets hurt all the time, but his per-game production as a last-round pick is insane. If you get 6 weeks out of Desean Jackson, 6 weeks of him being a high-end wide receiver 2 for Philadelphia, and then he goes down for the year, that is a successful last-round pick. Because let's be real, you're going to make a bunch of waiver moves. You can drop him, some flexibility on the roster. But if you're getting league-winning production like he did last year in week 1 for a few games, you take it. I mean, the last round is just a crapshoot. And Desean Jackson is a guy who, if he's on the field, he's a start every single week. He can score from everywhere on the field. And if he plays a full 16 games and you draft him in the last round and Jeffrey's out for a majority of the time, he's putting up 1,000 yards. I mean, it's easy. You look at the division he's in. The Giants, Redskins, and Cowboys have terrible secondaries. I'm a Giants fan. We have terrible secondary. I mean, he's going to kill the division games. The Eagles are going to be passing the ball a ton, I think. They lost Jordan Howard. I mean, they have good pass receiving backs in Miles Sanders and Boston Scott. They may go spread offense more. I just think Desean Jackson is being way underdrafted, and I understand why, because he gets hurt all the time. But when he's on the field, you can start him and be confident that he's going to play really well. And as I said before, his ADP is 149. He's a last-round pick. I understand he had the off-the-field issues with some of the comments he made. But if that doesn't bother you and you're looking to win your league and you're looking for players late in drafts that can help you win your league, Desean Jackson is that guy to go to. And he's going to be a great value in the later rounds. I think all these guys at wide receiver are guys that I'm going to be looking at all throughout the draft, including Calvin Ridley and Marvin Jones. Make sure to watch those videos. But Calvin Ridley, Marvin Jones, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, DK, Devante Parker, Desean Jackson, they're scattered throughout the draft board. So if you have guys you need to take over, such as running backs, there's other guys later and earlier you can grab. But these are all guys who I think and believe in that will outperform their ADP greatly. And they're all reasons why you have to go running back early. I'm going to be putting out a running back undervalued video shortly after this one, so make sure to look out for that one. And make sure to leave your comment down below saying which of these guys do you believe in, which of these guys do you have some doubts on. Are these any of these guys that you'd be drafting in all your leagues? Let me know. I'm curious to see what all of you think down below. And make sure to follow us on our socials, and mostly our Instagram, where we post a lot of our content a little bit prior to our YouTube videos. And our profile name is Gridiron_Guys_YT, so make sure to go drop a follow and check us out there too. And stay tuned for our video on the undervalued running backs coming up in a few days.